So we are going to get started promptly at 2:55 p.m. We're just going to let some people let more people get in, and we'll get through that. But I also want to thank you guys so much for coming today. It really means a lot. So we are going to get started promptly at 2:55.
We will be starting in about 3 minutes. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. We just wanted to welcome everybody to this today. It's amazing how many people that have joined, so thank you so much. This is gonna be so amazing. So on behalf of the Black Student Union or Black Students Association, we just wanted to provide you on our reasoning on why we wanted to create this club in the first place. So I'm gonna go ahead and read that. So we wanted to create this club in order to provide a safe space for not only Black students who go to New Albany, but also students from different racial backgrounds. We believe it is important to have a crucial and informational conversations about race in a predominantly white space such as New Albany High School, and we hope to foster growth in students through diverse cultural and social programming in order to enhance understanding and unity in the New Albany Plain Local District. And so now I'm just going to pass it on to Eden, and she's going to explain why this is so important and why we're having this meeting today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eden Kabidi, and before we finally dive right into today's discussion and interview with Dr. Muhammad, we would like to elaborate on the importance of this meeting we will be having today. With today's climate of violence being brought to the media, it has been brewing many different conversations and has made room for enlightenment together as a society today. As we push forward in light of these unprecedented times, we should always make room for discussion in how these current events have affected so many. Black Lives Matter has been a powerful movement ever since 2013, but this movement has only gotten so little of attention to the crowd until this year when deaths like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, shootings right in our city like Casey Anderson, and so many more that have been brought right on our TV and phone screens. It's important that we never forget about these people and never lose sight of the fact that we are still fighting for them. The importance of advocacy, standing up for your Black friends, showing them you care and you're with them as they witness what is happening and are afraid of what might happen to them. The importance of having those uncomfortable conversations. Thank you for listening. And now we'll get into our interview with Carter Miner and Dr. Muhammad. I hope you enjoy and are able to take away something.
Thank you very much, Eden. Well, first, I wanted to thank Dr. Muhammad for coming and being with us today. It really means a lot. And I also wanted to tell you guys that we will be taking questions at the end, so you can type them into the chat, or you can also fill out this form if you want the questions to go through as well. I also wanted to get started off by just, again, thank you, Dr. Muhammad, and just let you guys know who Dr. Muhammad is. Dr. Khalil Girban Muhammad is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. He's the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. He's the award-winning author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, and a contributor to a 2014 National Research Council study, The Growth of Incarceration in the United States, Exploring Causes and Consequences. Dr. Muhammad is a frequent reviewer and commentator in national print and broadcast media outlets, such as the New York Times, Washington Post, The Nation, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, Moyers and Company, and MSNBC. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries, including the Oscar-nominated 13th and Slavery by Another Name. He's received the 2017 Distinguished Service Medal from Columbia University's Teacher College and holds 2 honorary doctorates. He is on several impressive boards and has won even more notable awards. I am so excited to talk to him and for all of you experience his brilliance. I've known Dr. Muhammad since I was 7 years old, and now I have the privilege of sharing our conversations with you. So, Uncle Khalil, I'm sorry, Dr. Muhammad, are you ready to go?
I can see, Carter, you haven't lost your acting ability. That was good. That was very tricky of you.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be here, and a real delight to meet your New Albany community. Of course, we miss you and your whole family terribly here in South Orange, New Jersey, but it's nice to drop in today.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think we came here to talk about Black Lives Matter and the importance of advocacy, but I really wanted to start by starting right from the beginning. So I wanted, after reading some excerpts from your book, especially The Condemnation of Blackness, it seems like much of your research shows that subjects of racism in policing is as old as policing as itself. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So first, the period when the colonial era begins is a period of chattel slavery, the period when enslaved Africans are first put to work to build wealth in the United States, or what would become the United States. And so going from the 1600s through to the end of the Civil War, this system of slavery was incredibly violent. Human beings treated as property wasn't just something that was put on paper or as a legal code, but in fact required incredible effort by people to oppress others. And so something like slave patrols emerged pretty early on in the colonies as a mechanism to ensure that Black people would not escape from their enslavement, that they would not pose a physical threat of liberation or revolution against their plantation owners, or that they would not join in concert with other landless whites, early in the period indentured servants, who shared a collective interest in no longer being exploited by elite plantation owners. And so there's really no history of policing that doesn't run through our slavery history and the role of white men in the effort to constrain Black lives. After slavery, of course, we see the reinvention of forms of oppression that involve a more robust criminal justice system. So a lot of people have heard something about chain gangs or convict leasing. These were mechanisms and instruments used across Southern states to make sure that Black people would be treated as second-class citizens and would be coerced, that is, forced back into exploitative labor contracts. And Southern sheriffs and deputized white men were in concert, often with racist vigilante organizations like the Ku Klux Klan or other white supremacists, or what we might call today domestic terrorists, that often use violence or the threat of violence to essentially subdue a now free Black population who were citizens of the United States. This goes on for 100 years in the South and culminates in the Civil Rights era, where Southern sheriffs often turned police dogs on young Black children, advocating for their civil rights. Southern sheriffs tried to jail peaceful protesters by locking them up and putting them in harm's way, often because of sexual violence within prisons by prison guards, or on what were then called prison farms. These were places where incarcerated people did the work of slaves, but as incarcerated people. All of this went on during the Civil Rights era, which means that in the course of your parents' lives, lifetimes, and mine, this is very much part of our history. There's another version of this history, which is going on in northern cities when Black folks begin to leave the South and go to places like Chicago or New York or Cleveland or Dayton or Columbus, Ohio, all these places that become important landing places for Black migrants in the early 20th century. Police officers often served the role of keeping Black people out of white neighborhoods and out of white communities, and enforcing forms of systemic racism that were not on the books in these places, but were very much part of custom and everyday practice. And so there's a long, long history of racism in policing, and much of the effort to fix that racism has been going on for about a century.
Right. And I know you talked about the difference between the South and the North, and I thought that was very interesting because I was doing some research, and one of the greatest showdowns between police power and the anti-slavery movement took place right here in Ohio when bounty hunters snatched a free man and tried to drag him to Kentucky under the fugitive slave law. And my question to you is, were these laws a model for policing after slavery?
Well, yeah, in a sense, the Fugitive Slave Act, the first use of national power to sustain slavery was baked into the Constitution, ratified in 1790. The Fugitive Slave Act gets more and more power and strict enforcement mechanisms. Sometimes there's laws on the books, but weak enforcement. And so the Fugitive Slave Act goes from being kind of an idea that when Black people escaped from plantations, that northern colonists and then eventually northern states would have, or I guess just to say northern states would have the responsibility of returning the property back. By the 1850s, essentially every white person in the North is deputized to become slave catchers or slave patrollers. That's the effect of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And so, yes, that federal law incentivized and set a model for how local people would respond to the problem of escaped Africans. And of course, you know, the line between Kentucky and Ohio was a fervent place of the Underground Railroad. And a lot of people moved, particularly in the Cincinnati area, from literal slavery to freedom by crossing the Ohio River. So Ohio has long been a kind of central place in the longer story of Black freedom, because so many Black people who escaped from slavery came to Ohio long before the Great Migration period, which of course begins during World War I in the 1910s.
Yeah, and I think you talk about this obligation or this incentive to bring the slaves back to the South. And I think slavery, they fought so hard to keep it. Was this because they were fearful that something bad would happen when those Black people became free, or they wanted the money that was coming from it?
That's a good question. Well, it's sort of always been more about the money than anything else. So a sort of easy takeaway, slavery, while students are often taught, was this kind of bad thing that happened a long time ago, and you know, it is the real face of racism in America. Everything else pales in comparison. So the closer we get to the present, the less racism is really a problem. But the truth is, if you look at slavery and why it happened in the first place, because it was part of a global system called the Atlantic slave trade, of which the British colonies were a small part of it. The numbers of people who were taken from West and Central Africa number about 12 million, and about 10.5 million survived what's called the Middle Passage, which was the transatlantic voyage from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, to North America, Central America, and South America. And about 10 million people stayed between South America and Central America, or the Caribbean islands. Only about 600,000 landed in the British colonies. So when we look at the bigger picture and a global economy that emerges that we eventually call capitalism, slavery and racism were always about power and exploitation and wealth accumulation. All these ideas about Black people deserving of slavery, or being inferior, or not as smart, or built to do work and rather than to think, whatever stereotype racist idea that someone came up with, was always in the service of exploitation, was always in the service of taking someone's labor power or their land and harnessing it for their own benefit, which is a similar story to what happened to indigenous people all across the Ohio Valley, and of course, in most parts of the United States. Their land is what mattered most. And so when they stood in the way of that, they were killed. So racism is the child of that exploitation, of that desire to build wealth. And in some ways, the echoes of the desire to build wealth are very much part of 2020, very much part of the tension between economic inequality, and ongoing systemic racism.
Right. And I think that was a good tie into what I was going to ask you next. It seems like a lot of the problems that African Americans, especially in America, have stem from slavery, but there are groups of people who try and deny that. So what would you say to those people that deny that these problems that we're having now are from slavery itself?
Well, one way to look at this, so there are economists and other empirical scholars who look at wealth creation and data in particular around wealth. And so I'm going to give one example. We know a lot more about the relationship of the wealth accumulated during slavery in the 19th century, that is between 1800 and 1865, than we do between 1600 and 1700 into the 1800s. And so if we just look at the antebellum period, we know that at the end of the antebellum period, right when the Civil War begins in 1860, the value of all enslaved people was roughly $3 billion, which was 48 times all of the, oh my gosh, I'm thinking about this. Okay, scratch that, because I can't remember the statistic off of my head. It is more than the banks and the railroads, and it's 48 times, now remember, the size of the federal government's budget at the time. So if you could think about the enormity of the value of human life at that time, the entire economy rested on slavery, including in the North, where gradual abolition laws had taken root during the constitutional period. And so by the 1820s, there really were very few enslaved people in places like Ohio or Illinois or Pennsylvania, et cetera. So to answer your question, when economists look at the 1860s in particular, they not only look at the value of the economy rooted to slavery, which meant that everyone had an economic, or should I say, economic skin in the game. But there's another way to look at this. Something called the Homestead Act passes in 1862. All of you have learned about it who are in high school in US history. The Homestead Act grants a plot of land for very cheap prices to white settlers and a very small number of Black people. Economists estimate today that because of the land grant of the Homestead Act, that something like 45 million Americans from that period today owe their wealth accumulated over time, passed on from one generation of white family to another generation of white family, which again, Black people had not only been enslaved and so missed out, they were the wealth, and then were subject to state-sponsored discrimination in the Homestead Act, leaving basically the significance of Americans' white middle class tied directly to government intervention. We talk a lot about socialism and capitalism, about freedom and government control, and Ohio is ripe for this, given that it's historically a swing state and we just went through an election and so on and so forth. But the truth is that the government has been giving white people property and access to other people's labor, whether they were indigenous people, whether they were people of African descent or Chinese immigrants in the mid-19th century who helped to build the railroads. White elites, white middle class, and to some degree, although much less than, landless and low-income whites have all benefited economically from that system, and they've been able to pass that wealth down one generation to the next to their own families. That some of them happen to be poor today doesn't mean this didn't happen. It just means that in a society ripe with economic inequality that also impacts white people, all white people didn't benefit equally. But it doesn't mean that racism didn't benefit whites to the detriment of Black people, going back from slavery all the way to the present.
Right, and I think that's something that we talk about because you always hear the phrase 40 acres and a mule. When did that come?
Never. Oh yeah, so a good question. I skipped over that. So there was this brief moment when a Civil War general, Sherman, who burned down Atlanta, decided in the field that, well, first of all, there's a more complicated story. Black people in South Carolina and in the Georgia Sea Islands were some of the earliest people to be freed because they were already isolated from the mainland. And as a function of their freedom, they had a robust kind of semi-autonomous community. When they began to work with Union officers in the field of battle, they said, hey, listen, we feel good about what's likely to happen with the outcome of this war. But in the meantime, we think if we can grant Black people parcels of land and a little bit of husbandry, that is animal power, to help to cultivate the land, we can begin to establish independence so that when freedom comes, when this war is actually over, we ourselves would be productive contributors to this society. And so that's where the 40 acres and a mule came from. And ultimately, it was rejected by the president and did not go through. So it was a short-lived reparations plan that ultimately did not take root.
Okay. So we've talked about the history, and from what I'm hearing, it seems like slavery and police, they have been a problem for Black people for so long. And this story is not new. All these stories are not new stories in the sense of they've happened before, but it seems like this problem has been around for so long, and yet people continue to deny its sincerity, why these stories that are happening now are important. People continue to deny that. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, so Americans are terribly misinformed and miseducated about their own history. The first example of this is really obvious. No other part of the world, or should I say, most other parts of the world have had wars or civil wars where monuments to the enemies of the state, the people who waged war against the nation, would dot the landscape of those countries. One of the first things for young people who are on this call, they're too young to have witnessed this firsthand. First thing that happened when Saddam Hussein was killed and Iraq was liberated by the United States during the period after 9/11 was the toppling of a statue of Saddam Hussein. There are no monuments to the Nazi Party or to Hitler that stand in Germany. The South African government has done everything it can through the process of truth and reconciliation to scrub the country of the celebration of its apartheid era. Only in America, literally, can you have more than 1,000 Confederate monuments dotting the landscape of the country, most of which went up 50 years or later after the Civil War. Some of them went up in the 1950s to oppose the Civil Rights Movement. Not only do you have all of these Confederate monuments, you also have people who were out and out segregationists, who argued against the mixing of the races, who supported the outlawing of interracial relationships, who insisted that Black children did not deserve the same equal educational opportunities as their white counterparts, who did everything they could, like throw Molotov cocktails or support police violence when Black people living in a free nation tried to live in a community based on having the money to afford a home in that community. And so many of these political leaders, social leaders, business leaders were never unclear about where they stood in history, just like Donald Trump has never been unclear about where he stood in history. And then, they named gymnasiums, they put their names on buildings, they took their money and gave them professorship or chaired professorships with those names. The Washington Redskins, for example, just changed this, or at least took off its Redskins names, because for a long time we have mocked the history of Native Americans and what we did to indigenous people. So you put all that together, plus the fact that we still don't do a good job teaching the actual history of the United States as it happened. Slavery is mostly a footnote, kind of an unfortunate chapter in American history, something about some bad people who were racist, but most people were not. This sort of thing, because most people, it turns out, were not slave owners. So that means somehow they weren't racist or part of a racist system. I mean, it's astounding. And so, of course, people who have been taught that America is the greatest nation on earth, that its flaws are better than anybody else's flaws in the world, and that Black people should stop complaining about racism because it's not real. Of course, they still walk around thinking that mostly everything is okay and that these things are not a big deal.
And that is something that continues to confuse me, that they can see all these things going wrong. But now to just get more into the Black Lives Matter portion of this conversation, the Black Lives Matter movement has received a lot of criticism. One common response is people saying all lives matter when people say Black Lives Matter. And what would you say if you could talk directly to a person that thinks that's the right response?
Well, I don't have anything new to say to this because this debate has been going on for a long time. But I do understand that you're in a high school community and young people sort of learn at their own pace, and that there might be a freshman today who missed the headlines going back to 2014. But I guess if we could imagine, if we could put ourselves in the space of gender relations, and maybe most students today recognize that we don't treat girls and women who participate in sports, for example, equally. They don't usually have the same budget for their sports programs. The US women's soccer program is still fighting through lawsuits and others to get equal pay, even though they're way more productive and successful than the men's team. I think most people get that girls' lives don't still yet matter as much as boys' lives, and we still live in a patriarchal society that supports men above women and still pays them more on the dollar. I think something like the average woman makes 70 cents of every dollar. I mean, maybe some people don't believe that, but if women came up with a slogan who were feminist or other women leaders in our society and said, girls' lives matter, and men started saying all lives matter, I think people would understand why not only is that insulting, but it is a distraction from the problems that plague us. Women wouldn't need to say girls' lives matter if in fact we equalize their opportunity structures, if we stop discriminating and objectifying against women, if we didn't just go through a Me Too movement, which was all about how women in the workplace were being subject to sexual predation, and nobody was doing anything about it. So it doesn't take much to analogize from there to Black people who we've watched be killed in broad daylight and any number of excuses to make up for those killings, or the fact that we know Black people are still subject to out and out discrimination in retail establishments, in housing markets, in educational systems where they are tracked. And so anybody who's arguing for all lives matter is essentially saying, either I don't believe you, or two, I don't care. And so it is what it is. And there will always be in this society people who reject any responsibility for racism. There will be people who deny that racism is real, just like there will be people who are sexist pigs who think that women are in fact inferior. Let me give you an example. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School. It is one of the leading public policy schools in the world. We have statesmen and political leaders from all over the country get an education. The former president of Liberia got her degree from the Kennedy School. The former president of Colombia, the country, got his degree from the Kennedy School. Many members of the Obama administration are my colleagues who teach there. And I forgot my point about the Harvard Kennedy School. I had to set up what the place is so that everyone would understand it, and now I forgot what the point is. Carter, help me out. What was I saying just before I was defining the Harvard Kennedy School?
You said, I got so distracted by who you were listening. I was like, oh, these cool people, all these nice names.
What was the prompt?
It's about the unequal.
Oh yeah, it was unequal. You were talking about the Me Too movement.
Yeah, about the Me Too movement. So here is a place where we know for a fact that women, at the end of the day, are still moving up the ladder of opportunity and success in this country. And the Kennedy School is a place that, we have 78% of our faculty are men, similar number are white. And so people look at institutions like this and they know that everything is not yet equal for white women in particular, or women in general. So at every sector of our society, either you believe that women, I know what my point is. Either you believe women are inferior or Black people are inferior, or you don't. This is what Ibram Kendi, who's become a popular scholar about anti-racism, would say. Either you are an anti-racist or you're not, which means if you're not, then you're kind of okay with racism. This is what I was going to say. The former president of Harvard University, who is a colleague of mine at the Harvard Kennedy School, famously said about 10 years ago, his name was Lawrence Summers. He was also the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama. He might show up in the Biden administration, who knows? He basically said, you know, according to math and science data, women are not as good at these subjects. This was about 10 years ago. So any effort to redress systemic inequality or discrimination is going to bring out people who will defend those systems. It doesn't make it any less oppressive. It just means that, you know, we live in a society where people have all kinds of crazy ideas. It doesn't mean we have to listen or follow them.
So yeah, I think that's something that everybody in this call should understand, is that we also stand in a place where people like to deny the truths that are happening right in front of them. And something that goes along with people saying all lives matter, and what you were saying, where they say all lives matter to girls' lives matter, is people bring blue lives matter. So I don't know what a blue life is, but I wanted to know, is saying all lives matter and blue lives matter, is that saying the same thing, or is those separate things?
Often people who use all lives matter to deny the importance of systemic racism and the need to end it are also people who support blue lives matter, but they don't necessarily have to be one and the same. To say a little bit about Blue Lives Matter grew out of a reaction to Black Lives Matter by members of the law enforcement community. And unfortunately, what started as a slogan actually moved legislation in a number of states where bills were proposed to protect officers from the so-called violence that they were experiencing as a result of Black Lives Matter. Now, there are already laws on the books that protect officers from retaliation or violence directed at them, but this created a special category, and this is really important. The special category was to add them to what we call legally a protected class. Usually protected classes are people who cannot change something about who they are. You know, generally speaking, the law recognizes that sex is something you're born with. Now, gender is a different question. People often can switch their genders, and we have more recognition of non-gender conforming people. And of course, some people can actually change their sex. But generally speaking, the law recognizes sex as a protected class. It recognizes race as a protected class. Things like nationality, where you were born, you can't really change. And religion is a protected class because it's enshrined in our Constitution. But generally speaking, we don't have protected classes for things you can volunteer to do. Volunteering to be a police officer, which is what people do, means you sign up for the rules of engagement and you follow a set of laws that, one, protect you, but also protect the public from inappropriate use of your discretionary force. So this is an absurdity, but in a society where we have a democracy, people can basically pass laws that just about do anything except when they're challenged constitutionally. And unfortunately, the power of police unions in this country means that there's a lot of political support for policing, and there's also a lot of fear of political retaliation by challenging policing. The good news is that when I last looked at this, about 32 bills were passed to have Blue Lives Matter laws, and most of them did not become law in most states. Louisiana is one state in particular where they did become law. But it's mostly a movement that basically says police officers deserve the same civil rights protections as Black people do. But of course, Black people are born into their Blackness and born into a history of oppression. Police officers are not born into anything that they can't come home at night and take off a uniform, nor is there any history of oppression of policing. So it's absurd. But we have a lot of absurdities in America. And unfortunately, those absurdities map onto a level of ignorance and miseducation in our country, which means in an open democracy, uneducated, miseducated, absurdities and racism and everything else you can throw at it can still go to the ballot box and cast a vote. And so we got a lot of problems that we have to work on, but it starts with having conversations like this.
Right. And you talked about how Blue Lives Matter has been made a partisan issue. And I think that happens a lot with a lot of important things that are going on in our country. They've made Black Lives Matter, wearing a mask, and things like that partisan issues. Do you think they do that on purpose? Because they know teachers can't talk about it. It will make the conversation harder to have because they give it this partisan issue, even though it's something that is important. Do you think they do that on purpose?
Man, Carter, you are getting really smart. I mean, I knew you were smart, but somebody's doing something right there. That's a really great question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. By turning something that should not be up for political debate into a partisan issue renders it more difficult to, as you perfectly described, in an educational setting to actually talk about it. The better analogy for this, in order to see precisely how manipulated all of this is to look at the climate change problem. So the entire scientific community across the globe agrees that climate change is a man-made crisis, that if men and women and human beings react to it in a timely fashion, we have a decent shot at saving the planet. Hard stop. And yet, because there's a lot of money at stake for doing more of the same in terms of fossil fuel extraction within the energy sector, and because the energy sector, like ExxonMobil, for example, which produced a CEO, Rex Tillerson, who became the Secretary of State, you know, like all of this is real, has a lot of money, and money shapes our politics in profound ways, means that people who want to discredit the science of climate change could in fact weaponize climate change denial as a way of winning elections. And that's exactly what happened. Because if you could say, you don't get to be a coal miner anymore in some little patch of Ohio near West Virginia, then you could say, well, I want to be a coal miner, even though my daddy and my granddaddy died of coal mining, it's still my freedom to be a coal miner. So, okay, people want to die in a coal mine, just like people don't want to wear a mask, and you know, they get to do that. So you're right, some things should not be partisan issues, should not be politically weaponized, and yet they are. And so again, what happens in our schools really matters, beginning in kindergarten, in terms of how we socialize young people about the world we live in. I hope that one day we can educate children not only to take care of our planet, not only to take care of their own bodies in terms of sexual health, but also to take care of each other in terms of understanding the relationship of racism and bias and bullying, which starts very young in our society and only gets worse when we turn our eyes and avert away from what is actually going on.
Okay, yes. And that was a great point that you made with starting younger. And I think as children, we look to, oh, well, he left. Oh, he left for a second. Let's see if we can get him back in. Yeah, I think his internet went out. Let's see. Well, while we wait, does anybody have any questions? You can put them in the form and we can get those ready for him. We're gonna be moving to advocacy when he gets back. So let's see how quickly we can get him back. There he is. Okay, someone let him in. All right, let's have to find him again. I can't see.
Right there.
Where? Oh yeah, there he is. Okay.
Sorry, unmute. My computer died and it gave me no warning. It just said it shut down. So I'm on my iPad. All right.
Okay.
You're talking about young people.
Yes, we were. Once again, let me spotlight you. Okay, so I wanted to get more into young people because as children, we kind of look to people as role models. And a lot of times we look to companies, and you wrote an article with Erica Litch on July 7th in 2020, and it was in the Boston Globe, and you speak of companies announcing their support for Black Lives Matter and why that really isn't doing enough. And what should companies be doing is my question to you.
Oh, that's a great question. So the private sector, that's companies, corporations for the students, plays a huge role in not only providing the vast majority of jobs. Most people work for a private employer. Most people do not work for the government. So all of us are, to some degrees, interconnected based on the jobs that we have. Depending on the size of the company that you work for, that company, a very large Fortune 500 company, a place like General Motors or Apple or Google or Home Depot, you know, you name it,
Any one of these very large companies also has a lot of political clout, because in our country, in the United States, our democracy is tied to money, because money shapes the way that political ideas move in our society. The easiest way to give this example is through political campaigns. So what you see on television when someone is promising to fix something is based on money. And it costs a lot of money to put on a television campaign or to buy a television ad. Michael Bloomberg, for example, spent $5.5 million for 30 seconds of campaign ads during the Super Bowl last year. Donald Trump spent the same amount of money for 30-second spots. The two of them had 2 spots, so each spent $11 million each. Can you imagine what $11 million could do for the new Albany school or the entire school district that you all are in? So who pays for those things? Well, corporations can spend a certain amount of money, and individuals who are wealthy because of corporations can spend a lot of money. So for a long time, companies have been part of systemic racism because they have participated in discrimination at the workplace. They've not hired people based on equal merit and talent. They've also contributed to various predatory practices. For example, in the financial sector, many banks deliberately sold bad products to African American and Latinx homebuyers during the mid-2000s, which led to the Great Recession, where the vast majority of people who lost their homes due to this massive economic fallout, which happened about 10 years ago, was a function of the banking system and the choices that it made. So companies also pollute, and they direct a lot of the environmental toxins that they release in the world in low-income, often communities of color. So there's this huge space where companies are directly involved in the exact same kinds of systemic racism that Black Lives Matter and other movement activists are focused on. And so when George Floyd happened and they issued all of these letters, what they were initially trying to do was to say to their customers and to their employees that we care about Black people. But that doesn't mean that they're going to do anything different because they're saying that they value Black lives. So it's a lot easier to pull out a white sheet of paper, write Black Lives Matter on it, get 4 sticks of Scotch paper and put it on your store window and welcome your Black customers in there, than to actually say, we want to support defunding the police in this community, or to say we want a redistribution of local tax dollars to make sure that we have a more equal formula for all the schools that exist in this district, or we want to audit the local zoning practices that keep multifamily units out of certain communities because we don't want poor people of color to lower our property taxes. These are all things that companies play a role in because they influence legislative processes through their use of money and their political voice.
Right. And when you talk about corporations in general, I know I'm not a corporation, but I'm a part of a school, and that's like a corporation. It's corporation-esque, it's an institution. And I wanted to know, what do you think schools should be doing to support, and what advocacy, what are they responsible for, and with what's going on? What is their responsibility?
Well, school primary job is to educate. And so schools should make sure that they're not participating in a kind of unwillingness to make sure that curriculum reflects the actual truth of the issues that we're talking about. Things that make people upset, but that doesn't make them unworthy of being taught to our children. So there should be no school district anywhere in America that distorts the actual truth of America's racist past, that minimizes the way that this country has continued to take advantage of low-income people. Schools are part of the building block of our democracy. If schools don't teach us about the value of our democracy and the way that education helps to shape a functioning, healthy democracy, then it is right for a society where miseducation, alternative facts, distortions. I mean, look, I know that your school can never publicly tell you all who you should like or dislike in terms of voting for a politician. But I can tell you, as an expert and as a guest, Ohio just voted again for a racist liar in chief as president. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump can't take some credit for a good economy. But the truth is that slavery was a good economy for slaveholders. It didn't make slavery right. I mean, the fact is that just because jobs are created should not be the basis for a functioning democracy if it comes at the expense of basic human dignity, which is the lesson of slavery. But since we don't teach slavery, then a lot of Americans don't actually learn that lesson. The other problem is that students, if they're not taught well, don't become sophisticated interpreters of the news. And one of the things that Donald Trump would brag about his pre-COVID economy was based on a problem that every economist will tell you. You can never take full credit, and certainly in your first term, for economic upswings, because a lot of what makes an economy work takes a long time to happen, which means the prior presidential administration did a lot of work to not only get us out of the Great Recession, but to create the conditions for the economy to thrive, which also means that Joe Biden is going to inherit potentially some bad economic news, and he's going to try to say that Donald Trump is responsible for it. And he's going to be right, at least for a couple of years, because that's how this works. So our schools could not be more important in terms of their function and role in helping students to understand how important being educated consumers of our political class, knowing the difference between facts and alternative facts are. There's no more important institution in our democracy than what happens at school.
And I think that's very important because there's a lot of school teachers from my school in this call, and I think that's something that I think it's very important that you guys take away that with you today. I couldn't get that word out, sorry, but I've tried to create this kind of funnel. So we started with corporations, and then we went to schools, but now I want to talk about children in general. And I know you have children of your own, and I want to know what advice do you have to kids who are trying to be agents of change?
Well, first of all, I've got a daughter, Jordan, who you know, she's Jonathan's age. She's a freshman this year at Northwestern. And she has been really, really active the last 2 years. First, because of the climate change and the example set by Greta Thunberg in leading the Friday climate strike rallies that took root around the country. And I'd be surprised if there weren't a few of them in Columbus. So that's how she got involved. And the thing about it is parents play a huge role in supporting young people, because either you can support that or you don't. It's like, there's not a whole lot of middle ground here. And I believe that every young person ought to be taught to be civically engaged, because even though you can't vote until you get to be 18, people are voting on your behalf. And that doesn't mean that they're not accountable to you because you can't vote. This is what the whole pro-life movement is about, ironically enough. The same people who often organize around pro-life, that is protecting unborn children, see those unborn children as their constituents. But of course, they're not even born, let alone being 18 and can vote. And yet, in terms of the Republican Party and the politics of conservatism in this country, that want voter suppression and don't want everybody to vote. So you have to sift through these contradictions and hypocrisies and recognize that every child who lives long enough will eventually be a fully functioning adult member of our society and therefore able to politically participate. So you can't protect your kid from the messiness of the world by just hoping when they magically turn 18 or 19 that somehow they're going to care about all these things. You have to model this behavior for them. You have to create opportunities for them to learn and to engage. And while every classroom in a high school is not going to be a hotbed of civics learning and political engagement, that's true, and I'm not arguing for that. Schools ought to be places that create enough space, like the BSA, clearly here at New Albany, where these kinds of things can happen. Because we all want an active and engaged, learned community of voters and democratic citizens. If we don't want that, then we actually don't believe in democracy. And then we might as well join the history of authoritarian societies and fascist governments around the country where people really didn't want democracy.
You are so brilliant. I just want you to know that, because the things you say, I would never think of that, but that was like, that's a great connection to make. And I thank you so much for this conversation that we've had. So I'm out of my questions. I think it's time that we move on to the audience questions. So I know some people filled out the form, but I'll get us started by asking one of the questions sent to me. DJ Valentine says, I would like to hear his opinion on how President Roosevelt's New Deal after the Great Depression is still creating a home ownership and generational wealth gap for African Americans.
Excuse me, it's a great question, and the question is absolutely right. When the federal government commenced to support home ownership for working class white Americans during the late 1930s into the 1940s, the New Deal legislation, it didn't make it for whites only per se in terms of home ownership, but what it did was it adopted these private market practices that had essentially redlined communities where Black people were as being high credit risks or being a source of danger. And so to maintain segregation, the federal government absorbed those private practices and abetted or furthered this history of discrimination in the housing markets. And the legacy of that has been a huge source of wealth inequality in this country, because I've already talked about the Homestead Act, but if we look at the history of redlining and the federal government's role in it all the way up to the 1968 Fair Housing Act, that comes right up until the moment where my own mother lived in redlined segregated communities in Chicago, not in Birmingham, Alabama. So that means that whatever my mother could pass on to me was subjected to systemic racism in the federal government. So the student's question is one of the most important lessons of the 20th century when it comes to understanding what is systemic racism. Redlining is exhibit A in that story for more recent history.
Next, Kenny's gonna ask a question.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. Somebody asked, with the wake of BLM and many terms such as anti-racism have come to light, how do you explain these terms to people and put them to use?
Sure. So again, we talked a little bit about Black Lives Matter, but in a nutshell, when Black Lives Matter emerged as a hashtag in 2012, it happened because a 17-year-old was killed by a vigilante. Now that vigilante was acquitted of murder, which means technically speaking, he didn't commit a crime because he was acquitted on self-defense. Now we live in a society again where trial by jury means that jurors can also be racist and can let people get away with murder. Our president is about to pardon people who were convicted of crimes because they're his friends or because he sold pardons to them. So we can't always judge guilt or innocence by whether someone is acquitted or charged. Nevertheless, when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, 3 Black women coined the slogan Black Lives Matter because they were so devastated by the notion that somebody could just randomly kill a Black kid because they so-called believed they were a criminal. And Trayvon Martin was, eating candy and drinking iced tea. So that's how Black Lives Matter began. And then it led to a critique of systemic racism, particularly in policing. Anti-racism has emerged more recently because people who have been focused on getting white people to stop engaging in racist behavior. Sometimes it's as simple as name calling. Sometimes it's graffiti. I'm sure somewhere in Columbus, Ohio, there's allegations of white kids wearing blackface or brown face at a Halloween party, or calling the black kids on the basketball team names in a white suburban school district. These are like low level, like examples, but these are the kinds of things that hit close to home when it comes to kids and high schoolers in particular. So the levels that we can talk about also end up in the workplace, where people are passed over promotion, in stores where people are subjected to racial profiling. In Crawford, Ohio, I'm sorry, not in Crawford, in a place in Ohio, in a Walmart, a man named John Crawford was shopping for an air gun or BB gun in a Walmart where the gun was on the shelf and people were shopping, and some person saw him pick up the gun off the shelf to look at the packaging, and they called the police. The police came in and killed him right there in the Walmart. Now, of course, we know that white men get to carry guns, out in public. They go to the Michigan State House and challenge the mask order. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So the fact that there's so much explicit racial discrimination directed towards Black people, that white people kind of sit around on their hands and, some of them seem to have little concern about. The whole point of being anti-racist to say that if you don't believe racism is justifiable, if you don't want to live in a racist society, if you don't want to be a witness to people being mistreated and bullied, whether it's on a playground or in a grocery store, then you have to be anti-racist. Just like if you believe that women are subjected to sexist policies in the workplace, if you believe that women deserve equal pay for equal work, you can't just sit around and watch television and bemoan the crisis of inequality for women. You actually have to vote for politicians who will write legislation to protect women's rights. You actually have to demand of your employers that they treat women equally when it comes to pay equity or promotion. So anti-racist basically means that the only way racism ends is if people actively and intentionally fight against it.
We have another question from a student. One of my friends, Lily Wilson, she's on this call right now. So she has two questions. One, do you think that there is a solution to the racism and injustice in our world today? And do you think the problems of racism and injustice can ever be solved and go away completely?
So yes, I do believe there are solutions. Perhaps the most important solution is exactly what the theme we've been talking about, which is how do we teach young people to grow up to not be racist? Because in the absence of an early intervention, that's what's going to happen. We didn't solve the problem of marriage inequality between people who identify as gay or lesbian by continuing to stigmatize gay and lesbian people as somehow deviants and unworthy of their humanity. We taught people to see them as a slice of God's, innumerable creations, to see them as living, breathing, equal human beings, just like the rest of us. And so the same thing applies, which is why Black Lives Matter has been so important in terms of making this point over and over again. But if people take offense to Black Lives Matter, somehow diminishing their own humanity, well, if Black Lives Matter, that means you mean white people don't matter, which is, of course, absolutely absurd, because the entire society has been built to perpetuate white life, then we're going to keep seeing the same problem. So yes, we have to teach children early and often to not be racist, to understand how bias is one of the most pervasive forms of human mistreatment of other human beings. And just like any vaccine, children need to be exposed to the problem so that they can be inoculated against getting sick from it. And that, to me, is the thing that we are most capable of doing, and also one of the hardest things for us to be willing to do. But if you ask me, how do we fix this? That's my answer to fixing it. Because there'll always be politicians who will exploit division wherever they can find it. There will always be people who want to make a fast buck and they don't care who they kill or run over or pollute or whatever they're going to do to them to make it. There'll always be those people. It's the rest of us that are the people who stand between community and chaos. It's the rest of us who have the opportunity to say, not on my watch, that's not okay. But if we don't educate people to understand how this works, if we don't educate people to care about other people and to have empathy and self-awareness, to be courageous in the face of injustice, well, then these things just fester. Everybody knows what it's like to be on a playground and there's a bully and everybody's afraid of the bully. So the only way you teach people to not be afraid of the bully is to teach them to not be afraid of the bully, and also to hopefully teach the bully to not be a bully. But if we do nothing, then we know what the outcome is. So we have to do something very differently.
That's a perfect way of putting it. We have another question. We have another question from a teacher from the district, and it says, as a teacher in the district, how do I disallow this weaponization to affect what I, a teacher, or how I address this issue in my classroom? What are my protections under the law? How can the school district best provide direction, guidelines, and protections to its staff? Training seems like a start, but even after receiving training, our hands are still tied.
No, it's a really good question. This is not an easy lift, but nothing can be solved until the problem is faced, to quote a James Baldwin statement. I mean, literally, if we can put people on the moon or in orbit, we just sent a SpaceX program to send a rocket of folks out of space. Like, the notion that we can't solve all the technical, legal, policy problems that exist between the collective bargaining units of unions, the school board, decision making, how curriculum gets made, the relationship of training to practice in the classroom. I get it. It's a fair question. It's a really good question. So the short answer is there's no quick fix, right? We have to rebuild how education functions around these issues. But the truth is, it's achievable if we have the political power and willingness to do it. One of the ways that this is obvious is the president just spent, the last couple months of his presidency trying to restrict all federal agencies from doing anti-racism trainings. Why? Because if you train people to not be anti-racist, you have a better chance that federal agencies will not discriminate against their own citizens. So we know that this is important because when people resist the change, just like resisting anti-racist training, then you're onto something. So what I would say to encourage the questioner is to say, look, it really does start with advocacy. It starts perhaps with the teachers union that represents your school district. It may even start with the PTA or the PTO, where parents want to demand some kind of anti-bias curriculum comes into the school district. And then because these are political questions, school districts often have to sign off on such changes, but you need buy-in from parents, from teachers, from community members, and ultimately from the school district. It's just like anything else. There was once upon a time where you couldn't teach sex ed to kids. Why? Because to teach them about sexual education was to encourage them to have sex. So the idea was abstinence only, but that's absurd. Kids are going to learn about sex because they have these sexualized bodies. Their bodies were built for sex, period. So the only question is whether you're going to teach them or they're going to teach themselves. And so we have to think about bias as another part of the human condition. People will figure out ways to divvy themselves up and therefore to discriminate. And so if we want less of that, we actually have to do it. And I encourage teachers to figure out how to be advocates in their own school districts to help further this along, but it is not an impossible task.
Okay, so we have one more question before we close out, and it's from a student named Dominic Catrone, and he asks, some people have treated the Black Lives Matter movement as if it was a trend. What is your advice for those of us who recognize it as an ongoing issue to re-engage others who have lost their interest?
That's a great question. So I would encourage you to go to a website called Movement for Black Lives. It's got a simple URL, M as in Mary 4, B as in boy, L as in Larry.org, movementforblacklives.org. It's been around since 2015. It represents about 50 organizations around the country that have come together to identify a set of goals for the movement. And they've organized them around various issues from housing to education to criminal justice. And they've done model legislation and policy so that people know what to demand legislatively when they want to move from protest to political change. Because no matter how many people are in the street, at some point, you have to advocate for change. You can't just be like, we don't want this. You got to be like, we don't want this, but we also want this. And so it is a website that helps to pull together all of these decentralized, disparate organizations that seem like they're not working together, but in fact, they really are working together. And they've also come up with a 5-year plan. They have a plan to reach their goal in 2024 of creating a massive movement is one of their plans. I just looked this up before this call. They want to focus on local power. They want to do leadership training and a couple of other things, which I can't remember, but you can go and look it up and you can get involved. That's the thing about this. Like, nothing stands in the way of getting involved. My daughter is part of a local organization called the MAPSO Youth Coalition. And it represents a number of different young people in this community and surrounding areas. And they've written to the Attorney General of New Jersey. They have fought against development in the reservation. They are calling for various defund efforts in our local police agencies, which is wonderful because they're helping to make our community a better place. So I encourage young people to find an organization that suits their style and personality, that feels right for them, because there are a lot of them out there. And I can guarantee you, in the home where Michelle Alexander lives in Columbus, Ohio, there are plenty of folks there that can help you find your right community for the kind of activism that you want to get involved in.
She actually lives right here in New Albany. Her kid's in our grade, and I think in Kenny's grade as well. But I know this is a good stopping point. I know we could talk about this all day. I know I could. I think a lot of people would agree with me. But on behalf of the BSA and New Albany as a community, we'd like to thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to thank everybody who came to watch today. But I wanted to ask you one more question. I wanted to know if you could give us 3 points of wisdom before you go.
I think I've already given them to you, but I'll summarize. Know your history, or someone else is gonna define it for you. It's really important for everyone listening and watching this conversation to take history seriously. It's the bedrock for our society. It is what binds us together. The second advice that I would offer is to get involved, be civically engaged, be politically mindful. You're young people, most of you are not 18 yet. You cannot cast a vote, but you can express your perspective on the society you want to live in. An example of Greta Thunberg is wonderful. Malala from India is another example of young people who literally changed the conversation about pressing issues that govern our society. And I think that there's nothing standing in the way of anyone in the New Albany community from doing the same. The third example I will say is that believe in justice. We talk more about opportunity than we do about justice. And the problem with opportunity is opportunity leaves everything the same and then just says, all right, now compete. May the best person win. And the truth is that we have a rigged society. We have a rigged system. People in Ohio know this. They've just been duped to one degree or another to believe that this pathway versus that pathway is the way to deal with that rigged system. But we don't want a rigged system. We want a fair system. And getting to a fair system means we have to fight for justice, not just opportunity. Opportunity comes later. I don't want opportunity to be at a table of domination amongst a bunch of other people that are trying to figure out how to exploit other people. I want to be at a table of justice and compassion where fairness is the governing plan, and that we figure out a way to make sure that all of us are benefiting in this society. Some people call that socialism. I'm not sure we've ever seen a socialism that functions that way, because most of what has lived in the world as socialism has been attacked by the racist capitalists in this world. So I'd like to get to a place where we can actually agree on the common good, and that starts with believing in justice. So it's been a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. I can't tell you how impressed I am with all of you and the work that you're doing in that school. The questions, both from you, Carter, of course, really brilliant, but also Kennedy and Eden, as well as from the questioners in the community, just terrific. And so I want to tell the administrators of New Albany, watch out, because if you guys are standing on the wrong side of history, it's not going to be pretty. So thank you for opening this forum for these students. And I say that with all sincerity. It's really important.
But I think we all would want to return the thank you right back to you. It means so much for you to be here and to have this conversation with us, something that frankly needed to happen in New Albany itself. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming to this BSA meeting. It is the last one for the calendar year. So we really wanted to go out with a bang, and I think we did. And I'm very excited of how this meeting went amazing, greater than I ever thought it could. And I wanted to thank you all for coming, and I want you guys to have a safe and enjoyable holiday. And I just, Uncle Khalil, you are amazing. And I know when I met you when I was 7 years old, I was like, who is this smart guy? Because I was in his house for Christmas, and I was like, this man's really cool. And I just wanted to thank you so much, because from 7 years old, you've been a great impact in my life. And I think it's very important that you know that. And
well, I appreciate that, Carter. You make me very proud of you, and your mom and dad are pretty awesome too. So you know, you got good people in your life, and I'm grateful for being able to have the relationships with all of you that I have. So thanks for having me. So great to meet you both, Kennedy. Is it Aiden or Eden?
It's Eden.
Eden. All right. Sorry about that.
You're fine.
Okay.
But
So
I just, on behalf of the BSA, I'd like to thank you and good night to everybody. I hope you all have an amazing holiday.
Thank
all right.
you.
Bye.